point to peers, and that's that while gun ownership has quadrupled in this country over the last 20 years, violent crime is at a 40-year low. And while it shows the fallacy of gun control from a crime fighting standpoint, it's really not a statistic that makes 1,600 women and girls in this country who are raped every week feel any better, or the 25,000 people who are victim of a violent crime every week in this country. There's still bad people out there doing bad things to good people. I know that you've chronicled the DC situation with regards to buying a gun, but what was your reason? What started you down this path of wanting to become a gun owner?
Well, you know, it's amazing to me that I'm sitting on a panel with such honorable people talking about gun control, because I'd never shot a gun before 2 years ago. And I tell you, if it was 2 years ago and I was sitting in this seat, I would be worried that the sheriff's gun was going to jump out and shoot me. That's how little I knew about guns. You know, I still had this confusion that the guns acted as opposed to the people. But what happened to me is I was at a friend's house, I was dog sitting, and took the dog for a walk, and to make a long story short, I came back, entered the house, and found someone robbing a man. And obviously I surprised him, he was surprised to see me, and I luckily, thank God, was able to talk my way out so I wasn't hurt physically. He took my wallet, and then thinking I was the sheriff, I decided to follow him down the street to get a photo, and turned the corner of the driveway and found 2 pickup trucks parked in the middle of the road and 15 men standing there, because they'd been casing the whole neighborhood. They obviously saw me and started running at me, and I ran back in the house and then called the actual law enforcement. But going to bed that night, it was the first time in my life I ever thought, I wish I just had a loaded gun by the bed. Because if these guys come back and they want to rape me and they want to murder me, they're obviously on drugs, unless the police said they're in town to get drugs and get money. How will I defend myself? And it just changed from then on, I was like, I'm going to get a gun to defend myself. And now, 2 years later, I have a loaded gun by my bedside table in DC. It took me 4 months to get it legally, but I do a loaded gun and I've never felt safer.
Sandy, you have a unique perspective in this, both serving as a policymaker after your career in law enforcement. As you pointed out to Dick Durbin, you suffered through this as well. You lost your husband. I know that there's not only a professional but a personal respect for the Second Amendment that you have. Can you share your thoughts on that?
I think what I said to the senator was accurate. Criminals, by their very definition, do not obey the law. And I have seen it over and over again, whether it was in my professional life as a law enforcement officer or whether it was in my professional life as a policymaker. And the problem is that you can create all these feel-good laws that have no teeth, that will be ignored by the criminals, and the only people you hurt are the law-abiding citizens who have their weapons or firearms to protect themselves and their families. So if they really are serious about actually doing something that works, then they need to first enforce the laws they currently have on the books, which they are not currently doing, and look at the other drivers that are causing these violent crimes. I'm happy to discuss that with them, was always happy to discuss it with them, whether it was on the state level or on the federal level. But too many times you see politicians wanting to use this as a wedge issue to divide Americans, when in actuality, it's Americans that they need to be protecting. And by doing so, they need to enforce the laws they currently have. And I hope Eric Holder is listening, because he's one that needs to really do his job.
No, there's no question about that. And I do want to come back to the lack of prosecution efforts, but Sheriff, I'm sure one of the worst parts of your job is having to talk to families, and not only victims, but families of people who've been killed by these criminals in your area. I mean, what do you tell these sad families who've gone through these tragedies when it comes to protecting yourself and taking care of yourself when your police can't be there?
Well, you're right. What do you say? You know, you can't really find words, but Emily said something I think is interesting that she said toward the end of her story that she called the actual law enforcement. And this is what I've been trying to do in Milwaukee County in terms of flipping this equation, because Sir Robert Peel, the father of modern policing, said the citizens are the police are the citizens. So in fact, she was acting as a law-abiding citizen. I trust law-abiding citizens with firearms. I fear criminals. Now, self-defense is the first law of nature. All right? In order to do that, you have to be prepared. And that's the message that I was sending, not only to the law-abiding people in Milwaukee County, but to the criminal element as well, that we are now going on offense. Okay, when Wisconsin passed the Personal Protection Act, or CCW, they passed Castle Doctrine several years ago. I think there were like 165,000 people within the first year that applied for those permits. I looked and I said to myself, I got 165,000 people who are prepared to assist me in keeping their community safe. Here's why that's important. Because citizens, they want to play a role in their own safety. But when you're going up against an armed individual, you are at a distinct disadvantage. Well, guess what? The perps have something to think about now.
That's right. Sheriff, I appreciate that, and I want to follow up because it's a great discussion on this whole concept of self-defense and right to carry, permit laws, concealed carry. 50 states now allow some process, not all great, but allow for some process for law-abiding people to get a permit to carry and defend themselves. Wisconsin was late to the game. Now you're 49th state, you beat out Illinois, so that's good. But
better late than never.
Better late than never. But what we hear out of the gun control groups, no matter where we push these efforts to allow for lawful self-defense, is that it's going to be a Wild West shootout. Every street corner, there's going to be permit holders shooting at each other over fender bender, and people just aren't trustworthy when it comes to firearms. Have you seen problems in Milwaukee County with good people getting permits, going out and doing bad and crazy things?
No, like I said, I trust law-abiding people. Now, we live in an imperfect world, and I think everybody knows that. And there are going to be people from time to time that possess a permit or possess a firearm and then use it in a way that they shouldn't, okay? Then we deal with that individual. It's just like if somebody takes an automobile and drives it in a reckless fashion and kills somebody, would you want to take my vehicle away because they did that? So I would flip that around and say, why do you want to take my rights away, which you can't do anyway? But why do you want to try to take my rights away because somebody else acted in a foolish fashion? If somebody went into a theater and yelled fire, a crowded theater, would we be talking about taking your First Amendment rights away because they acted irresponsibly? No. What we would do is we would deal with that individual and they'd have to pay the price.
Well, and you'll hear that, well, eventually it will turn bad. But Florida proves that's not true. Because 27 years ago, Florida passed their permit law. 2.5 million Floridians have gotten permits to carry in that state. And 182 have since have gotten in trouble for doing something with a firearm. 0.00672%. I know you were there in 1987 when it was passed. What do you tell the people who don't trust law-abiding people to defend themselves?
I think that it's a myth that law-abiding citizens are just that, they're law-abiding. And I was a police officer on the streets in 1987. And I remember when the law was passed and everybody was, you know, you had all the hype about how it's going to be so bad and all of this. I didn't see it. And I never saw it. But I do know, and I keep going back to it, that the criminals, by their very definition, are criminals. And the criminal element is who should not have those weapons. Whether it's a firearm, a knife, they have different ways of harming our citizens.
Well, Emily, 50 states allow for some form of right to carry. But the Brain Trust in Washington, D.C., the City Council, actually moved in the wrong direction. And they had a very limited process, and they repealed it. Now, are you just too mean to be trustworthy with a firearm? What is it? Why does D.C., why are they so threatened by you wanting to be able to carry a firearm?
Well, obviously, the same thing in all the main issue states. It's the same concept that they believe in New Jersey and California and Maryland and New York, is that we individuals are not responsible enough to walk down the street and defend ourselves. That giving us a carry permit somehow is going to turn us into criminals. It's so bizarre to me, but that is the mindset. And I've repeatedly asked the City Council Chairman, Phil Mendelson, how do you just ignore this whole right to bear arms part in the nation's capital? It's kind of clear. I mean, the Second Amendment is not that long. They could read it. And he just says, well, you know, we have the White House, we have the Supreme Court, we have all these, Capitol Hill, and all these important people here in Washington. I make 2 points to him, repeatedly. He's pretty sick of me down at City Hall, frank. I point out to him, one, those people all have armed guards around them. So you, Phil Mendelson, really don't need to protect the president here, right? And number 2 is, I love the Supreme Court justices, but why is their life more important than mine? I mean, I'm the one walking down the street homeless, and I just repeatedly want to point out that we have states who do not allow concealed carry permits. They're called may-issue states, and the Supreme Court, I think, is going to have to take this up in the next, possibly the Drake case coming up, one of these cases, because these may-issue states basically don't give anybody carry permits. And we have a split on the circuit levels now. We've got the NRA-backed case in San Diego versus Maryland, New York, these other cases, Willard in Maryland. And so the Supreme Court's really going to have to weigh in, because the right to bear arms and carry permits is a deterrent. And I think what was really just sort of near you in Detroit, the Detroit police chief, James Craig, recently said he wants people to have concealed carry permits. I mean, and this is Detroit. He said because it's a deterrent for crime, because criminals don't know who they're going to hit and might actually shoot back, and that's why DC every year has increasing crime rate. But like over here, over in Virginia, there's no crime, because if they want my iPhone, they're just going to use a gun to my head, because they know I don't have anything but maybe registered mace. But go over to Old Town, someone might shoot back. I mean, it's pretty common sense. Criminals are stupid and on drugs, but they're not that stupid.
You know, Chris, Emily said something that's very striking. This is my copy of the United States Constitution and the Declaration of Independence. I carry this thing everywhere I go. I read this thing once a year from front to back, and it doesn't take that long to read. But as Emily indicated, the Second Amendment is pretty clear. You don't have to be a constitutional scholar to understand this. The Founding Fathers were not constitutional scholars, but they knew what they wanted for the American people. And they said at the end of that Second Amendment, shall not be infringed. What we need to do in this country is we need to get to the original intent of the Second Amendment, stop all this might issue, may issue, shall issue, because that's what complicates this whole thing. Like I said, the armed citizen made this country free, the armed citizen will keep this country free.
If you could drop that copy of your Constitution off to Dick Durbin and some of the folks up on the Hill. And another thing that's always frustrating when you listen to the Chuck Schumers and Dick Durbins is you watch them when they get sworn in and they put their hand on the Bible and they swear to uphold that document, but they just conveniently seem to forget the parts of it they don't like the Second Amendment, which is always just unbelievably frustrating.
And Chris, I just want to point out, this issue of right to keep Second Amendment issue and gun rights, it's not about party. Because, I mean, I'm ready to, Sheriff Clarke is a Democrat. I'm ready to elect you president at this point. I mean, because you don't hear this, right? So this is not about Democrats and Republicans. This is about Americans, and the majority of Americans believe strongly in their right to keep their arms. They do not want more gun control because they know by example that it's not working. It's just not a party split. It's about common sense, about logic, and what are the statistics. And the statistics show is, you will know that the more guns there are, crime goes down, the more permits there are. It's just, you know, people get it. And I just think this is one issue that does not, cross the party lines, or there are no party lines.
Yeah, and the criminals certainly aren't asking you if you're a Republican or a Democrat before they pull a gun on you. As I've traveled and talked to gun owners across the country, one of the things I hear is not only a fear and anxiety out of Washington, D.C., that I don't trust these people, they're coming after my freedoms, coming after my rights, but there's a local fear. There's, they pick up the paper and they read about prisoners being released early because of budget cuts, that they can't afford prison guards, or that cops are getting fired over budget cuts, or they can't work overtime, those sorts of things. Sheriff, I'm sure you're not immune to budget cuts. Have you seen 911 overwhelmed? Have you seen the delays get longer? What's been your...
Sure, public budgets are under stress right now. We don't have the resources that we'd like to have, but that's the reality. Okay, I don't whine about that. What I try to do is get people involved, people that I trust, law-abiding people, to help me and allow me to help them keep their community safe. So, I mean, you indicated these things like early release and second chance program. There was this discussion on that yesterday. Those are all great things to have discussions about, but the reality is that violent predators walk through our neighborhoods. We're putting them back into these already stressed neighborhoods, and they could care less about this document. They could care less about your rights. They could care less about what we're going to try to do to keep firearms out of their hands. But I get a kick out of how this discussion always focuses on, and this isn't something you did, but you asked, how many instances did a law-abiding citizen use a gun improperly? But yet criminals use these firearms, these means on a daily basis against other human beings, and that discussion never comes up. That's what I said we need to focus on. Not the law-abiding citizen, but the criminal element.
This has been a discussion that goes as far back as when I was a police officer, with budgets for law enforcement, whether it's law enforcement, EMS, firefighters, your public safety. And as our population grows, communities get larger, the criminal element looks at more and more targets, and law enforcement gets strapped. And so the help to law enforcement, as the sheriff rightly said, was having law-abiding citizens help with their protection.
But Sandy, you've been on both sides of the budget. You've helped write them, and you've had to deal with them as a law enforcement officer. How do you prioritize security and safety, which is something that again is in that book, is a responsibility of our elected officials?
Well, sometimes I think that gets lost, but that was one of the things that was created by our founding fathers, public safety of our citizens. That is our responsibility as government. So government needs to make sure that they prioritize that. There is no excuse for not prioritizing it.
I want to talk a little bit about this novel concept of gun-free zones, where honest, law-abiding people, once you cross a certain line, you're no longer trustworthy and honest and law-abiding. I don't want to start here. I want to start with this awful, most of you remember the situation in Kenya last year at the Westgate Mall, where for 4 days there was just tragedy and rampage. It was 172 people. What was it? They killed 72 people, wounded over 200 more. After that tragedy, which unfolded over 4 days, the head of the International Police Agency said, I want to read this quote, I hope they'll put it up on the screen. Ask yourself, if that was Denver, Colorado, if that was Texas, would those guys have been able to spend hours, days shooting people randomly? It makes police around the world question their views on gun control. Where would you have wanted to be? In a city where there was gun control and no citizens armed, if you're in a Westgate Mall, or in a place like Denver or Texas? Now, we all nod our head, and it's common sense, of course. You can't pray hard enough for a good person with a gun to show up if you're in a situation like that. But then you fast forward to last Saturday with China, where these madmen attacked people with knives, killed 33 people, injured 130 more. And the first thing I thought, I was watching it on the news, and I thought, man, I wish that somebody there had a gun. And then when they said there were a bunch of attackers, I thought, and I hope they have a high-cap magazine, because you're going to need it in a situation like that. But instead of a reflection of course you want an armed response there, I'm not making this up. This is what China recommended to their law enforcement officers: lion taming sticks. That's not a joke. Lion taming sticks. So, Sheriff, what would your deputy say to you if you provided them with lion taming in response to something like this?
First of all, it looks like a skit out of Saturday Night Live.
I know, right?
But in seriousness, gun-free zones get people killed. The only person that's safe in a gun-free zone is the criminal perpetrator. You mentioned the key phrase, stop the threat. When the police cannot be there in real time, when the threat is happening, somebody has to be there to stop the threat. All this stuff about hiding under desks. I'm not saying that you shouldn't do that thing. You get to make the choice as to how you're going to defend yourself, but somebody should be there, somebody has to be there to stop the threat. So that's why I believe, when I made that comment, the armed citizen is what makes our community safe, law-abiding armed citizens. Gun-free zones, and if it's a private business, and they want to put up that, they're like neon signs, they're saying to the criminal perpetrator, come visit us. That's what it's doing. I don't mind if a private business wants to have that policy, that's their business. But I'm worried about public spaces where they tell me I can't go to a public space, and that's where government makes the call. And so the government's making the decision for me and for you that you can't exercise yourself, your Second Amendment right, which includes the right of self-defense. That's where I have the big problems when the government imposes those gun-free zones.
And Emily, you've written, absolutely, you've written about some of the worst atrocities out there happening in these gun-free zones.
Yeah, and I want to make clear, this is something that liberal media and President Obama will say all the time, mass shootings are on the increase. You know, that's why this whole debate started a year ago after the horrible tragedy in Newtown, which all of us, you know, watched unfold on TV, and I mean, I know we were all crying. I mean, it's the most horrendous thing you can imagine, 6-year-olds. But President Obama exploited that, and Bloomberg, to just launch this whole year to push gun control. And they will never say this with fact. Mass shootings have not increased. And the Congressional Research Service did a study last April. They looked at 30 years. Mass shootings account for, on average, 18 deaths a year. They're horrible, but the reason that they're on TV and the reason that they're all on TV for days at a time is because they're rare. And it would be so much more helpful and honest if the president, after, say, the Navy Yard shooting or after Newtown, came out to people and said, these things are horrible, but you are safe. This is not getting worse. This is what this is. Instead, he comes out and says, this is getting worse. We're having more mass shootings. And to your point, so I just want to clarify that mass shootings have not increased, but all of these mass shootings that we've looked at in recent years, except for the Gabrielle Giffords who was shot in Arizona, all of them were in publicly said no gun-free zone. So, and we saw the Aurora shooter went past closer movie theaters to his home to pick the one that was gun-free. We don't know exactly what happened with Adam Bland's report didn't show, but there were houses closer to his house that had armed guards. So gun-free zones are such dangerous places. I don't think any parent should allow a sign that says gun-free on the building. I think that's so dangerous.
And there can be an open discussion on, and there should be a vibrant discussion on all of these things, but what we should all agree on is that a sticker in a window that says no guns allowed is not a school security plan. It's not a protection of malls or anywhere else.
Would you put it as a sign in your front yard? No guns allowed? Gun-free zone?
As the sheriff pointed out, that's a welcome to come and rob me with no hard response. We're starting to run out of time, and I do want to squeeze one more topic in, and that's the hypocrisy that we see coming out of the Mayor Bloombergs of the world. And then, as Sandy pointed out, the frustration over a lack of enforcement. And I have no problem with Mayor Bloomberg having armed security. Good for him. I have no problem with him hiring his full detail after he left. That's great that he can afford it. I was joking with the sheriff that I carry a gun because you're too heavy to carry. And we don't all have the luxury of hiring personal security. But they want to tell us that it's okay for them, but we're not worthy.
Yeah.
We're not trustworthy, and we're not good enough to be able to defend ourselves. So, Sandy, what do you say to them?
He's wealthy enough to hire his armed guards, and he doesn't have to carry. That's his choice. But the rest of Americans who want to carry, who want to protect themselves and their children and their families, they have that right based on the Second Amendment, and therefore he should not be trying to influence and cause these wedge issues just to do political. And it's definitely political, because we're both from different parties, but we both agree that the Second Amendment helps save lives. It helps people defend themselves.
And the good news in this is it's not just law-abiding gun owners, average people, average Americans all across the country that support this freedom. Rank and file law enforcement has always supported the Second Amendment. Rank and file law enforcement, and there was a police stop one survey that was done recently, and 9 out of 10 current and retired police officers support concealed carry laws. You're not going to hear that out of some of the chiefs, but that's the truth. And so, Sheriff, I want to thank you for being willing to come and talk about this today, and Sandy for your service and for your loss, and Emily, it's always great to spend time with you. And thank you all for staying and listening to us today. Hope you have a great convention.
Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Dan Garza, Executive Director of Libre Initiative.